Are we good now?
Yes, sir. You're good.
Okay. We'll call this meeting to order of the Actuarial Committee. And can we have the opening statement, please?
Yes. This is a special meeting of the County Employees Retirement System Board of Trustees Actuarial Committee. This meeting is being broadcast via video teleconference pursuant to KRS 61-826 and may be viewed by the public at the Kentucky Public Pensions Authority offices located at 1260 Louisville Road in Frankfort, Kentucky. It is also being broadcast to the public live via Facebook. If you are speaking and are not appearing by video, please identify yourself before talking. If the video or audio broadcast is interrupted, we will attempt to reestablish a connection. Connection cannot be reestablished within 30 minutes. The meeting will be adjourned and rescheduled to a later date.
All right, thank you. For the record, we need a roll call, please.
Yes, sir. Mr. Foster,
Here.
Dr. Carver,
Here.
Mr. Cheatham,
Here.
Dr. Hackbart,
Here.
and Mr. Powell.
Here.
Thank you.
And I understand there's no public comment. Is that true?
That is correct.
Thank you. Our agenda now calls for review and approval of our minutes of our previous meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes as we've been presented?
Make a motion that minutes be accepted as presented.
Thank you. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
All in favor of the motion to improve the minutes, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Is anyone opposed? And the minutes are adopted. Now we're looking at forward-looking return expectations, and is the Wilshire Group going to take care of that?
Yes, you have myself and Chris Tessman on. We'll just spend a couple minutes giving an update on the forward-looking expectations. We'll start on page 8 of the book.
Yeah.
So from a total portfolio level, just to give some context to where we've come in the last year, what we see here on the right side is your previous policy and the newly approved asset allocation policy, which came out of the last IC and then board meeting. You can see that the expected return on a 10-year forward-looking basis is now 6.36%, with a expected risk of 11.5%. So similar to what your previous policy was expected to produce, but with lower risk, over 100 basis points lower risk. How that compares to where we were a year ago, your previous policy a year ago had an expected return of about 7.25. And the reason for the drop of about 80 basis points in that time, you can see in the bottom left table, is the drop in equity expectations. So from here we're showing 6/30/23 to 3/31/24. That's because those are the dates of our assumptions that were used in the first and then subsequent rounds of the asset liability study. So we started this process using the 6/30 assumptions, updated to 3/31 for the most recent meeting where the new policy was approved. In that time, our equity expectation for public global equity was down 1%, and similarly, private equity is down 1.25. So the real driver of the diminished forward-looking returns is really that you've already experienced a big percentage of the return that we would have expected last year when you had a total portfolio expected return over 7%.
Thanks,
those
I needed
returns have
that.
been pulled forward essentially with double-digit gains in the fourth quarter of last year, and then again in the first quarter of this year. That was a big driver of this lower expected return going forward. And I'll turn it over to Chris to talk about a few of the details on our assumptions and how they changed over these from this period of 6/30/23 to 3/31/24.
Thanks, Craig. If we move forward one slide, and we all kind of take our time machines back to kind of middle of the year last year, 2023, I think we all know that we were kind of in a rising rate environment. So, the Fed was really combating the inflation war, if you will. They were quick to rise rates, and we were seeing that right around the middle of the year last year. And while all this was happening, real GDP was continuing to slow, but it still remained fairly strong at an annualized rate of 2%. So we kind of continued to hear this talk about a soft landing, whether we were going to move into a recession, but we were still seeing the economy kind of tick along at that 2% annual rate of growth. And really that was propped up a lot by consumer spending. The consumer remained strong. Job growth was remained very solid. So, there really wasn't any real concern in the economy as markets continued to kind of tread along. If we fast forward and we move to the next slide and we look at how the economy kind of presented itself just a couple of quarters later, the third quarter was actually a rough quarter, but the fourth quarter, there was a big rally in equity markets. So to Craig's point, where our equity market assumptions have come down meaningfully, that was largely driven by the valuations and the strong market performance that we saw in fourth quarter. And so that was, really just higher valuations. We pulled forward those returns from our 10-year capital market assumptions, in a very short time period. And we saw a meaningful reduction in our equity assumption just by over 100 basis points. And in fact, as the yield curve shifted a little bit higher through that same time period, we actually ended in a situation where we had a negative equity risk premium for the first time in our capital market assumption history. So even though if we look at the newly approved asset allocation that just passed the board's approval process last month, or earlier this month, that assumed rate of return on the portfolio actually moved up a few basis points with equity returns or with the equity allocation moving down because of that equity risk premium being inverted or having a negative equity risk premium. And if we were just kind of looking at the messaging that we're getting from the chair, Mr. Powell, he basically hinted, or he has come out and openly said that this economy doesn't feel like it's suffering from a current level of rates, meaning if we were to reduce rates too quickly, we could see that that inflation spike a bit, and we would kind of lose some of the forward momentum that we have made on the inflation, kind of bringing that back down towards the Fed target. So we are kind of now in a market where the market is pricing in potentially one interest rate cut towards the end of the year, whereas if you were to look back just a couple of quarters, the market was pricing in somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 price cuts or interest rates cuts. So we have seen a fairly different shift in sentiment of what the forward-looking expectations are for federal policy here, but the economy still kind of keeps ticking along. We just are in a situation now where we do have a lower overall equity return set of assumptions, and we are kind of being propped up now in a very kind of 180 from where we were a few years ago, with those core fixed income or yield bearing assets providing a lot of the return in our portfolio that we're kind of seeing diminished from the equity forward looking assumptions.
And just, I see Dr. Hackbart has his hand up. Just one comment before your question or comment. So an expected return of 6.36% with your new policy and our new assumptions, when you compare that to your assumed rate of 6.5%, that's essentially a 49.5% probability of hitting that rate. So the median expected return is 6.36. That, given the standard deviation, that is so close to 6.5%, that's essentially a 50-50 chance, given the assumption of a normal distribution, that you'll hit your 6.5% target over the next 10 years. But with that, Dr. Hackbart.
Just maybe you could talk a little bit more about real estate. I think we've been operating under the assumption that there was excess supply, at least office space, in major metropolitan areas. Are you more optimistic now about the office space, or basically real estate generally speaking? Because of the return here, it doesn't look out of place compared to other assets. But just talk a little bit more about that, if you would, please, and your perspective on that.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think there's any improved sentiment as far as office goes in our assumptions here. They're relatively unchanged over the last year. There are other areas of the market that are more opportunistic and could provide better forward-looking prospects. But I wouldn't say that office is necessarily showing any signs of being an area where we're getting optimistic at this point.
So no real fundamental improvement there as far as you can tell.
No, right.
Okay, well, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? We'll seeing none. Thank you for that report. We'll move right along in our agenda and look at the review of the actuarial assumptions. And
Yes, thank you.
Jane, are you there? Yeah.
I'm here, thank you.
Okay.
Getting myself off mute. Thank you so much. I'll review our economic assumptions today. Unfortunately, Danny couldn't be here today, but he does send his regards and apologizes for that. So every year, the CERS board looks at their economic assumptions for the upcoming valuation. If you remember, last year we looked at our economic assumptions in conjunction with the full experience study, but this year we'll just look at the three main economic assumptions. That's our price inflation assumption, our investment return assumption, and our payroll growth assumption. Kind of a high level headline, we're currently recommending no changes to these assumptions from the prior year, but we will go through each one. So if we go through next page, sorry, one more page down. Oh, one more page. Sorry, one more page. Didn't realize how long this letter was. So looking at this one, we're going to start first with our price inflation assumption. So our current assumption is 2.5%. The most important thing to note about this assumption is it's not really a material assumption when it comes to our valuation. It's more of a macroeconomic assumption that we consider when looking at our other economic assumptions for the valuation. And the reason why it's not that material is because CERS doesn't have any assumptions that are tied to inflation, meaning we don't have a COLA that's tied to inflation or anything like this. So changing this assumption doesn't have a material impact on the valuation or really any impact. But kind of looking at the forward-looking expectations, obviously we all know that inflation has been high these last few years. It's still ticking a little bit higher than that 2.5% assumption. But kind of looking at different professional forward-looking expectations, and especially looking at that Federal Reserve target, they are all in the range of around 2 to 2.5%, which leaves us to keep our recommended assumption at that 2.5%. So next we'll look at the investment return assumption. Wilshire did a great job here, so I don't know how much more I have to add to what they just, information they just gave. But when we look at your investment return assumption, again, we're not investment consultants. So what we do is we actually pull together capital market expectations from several different investment consultants. So that's what we've done here. We look at short-term expectations. That's generally 7 to 10 years. You can see those are the return expectations there at the top of this chart. And then we also look at long-term expectations. That's 20 to 30 years, and that's the bottom of the chart here. I will note that these return expectations are generally from the end of the calendar year, so the end of December. So that's going to be why they're a little bit higher than what Wilshire just showed you. But kind of looking at the capital market assumptions this year versus the capital market assumptions from probably about a year and a half ago, there's not a lot of change from when we last set our assumption at that 6.5%. And again, given the information that Wilshire just gave you, we're sitting right about 50% probability of exceeding that 6.5% assumption. Again, that leads us to recommend we keep that assumption where we're at. Before I move on to the payroll growth assumption, any discussion there? Any questions? Okay, so our final assumption is going to be our payroll growth assumption. So keep in mind the payroll growth assumption, this is our assumption, essentially how the total membership payroll is going to grow in the future. This is important because we collect contributions based on payroll. That's how we pay off our unfunded liability. So how are our payments towards our unfunded liability going to grow in the future? Right now, our assumption is 2%. So we assume that the total membership payroll is going to grow by 2% each year. That assumption is based off of two factors. The first factor is changes in your current active membership headcount. So right now, your active membership count is staying pretty steady. You can look at over these two charts right here over the last 10 years. Your active membership, there's some fluctuation year over year, but in general, your membership stayed pretty steady over the last 10 years. The second driver behind your change in membership payroll is going to be those salary increases that you get from your members. So you can see here on this chart right here, we've had 2 years of very large increases in your total membership payroll. And we have seen some increases in your total membership headcount over the last few years, but generally, we've also seen huge salary increases for your active members. So we can see we've seen big upticks in your active membership payroll. That gave us some relief on our rates. Higher membership payroll means more payroll to spread out those contributions, means lower contribution rates. But the question is, when we're looking at this payroll growth assumption, do we think those salary increases are sustainable over the long term? Keep in mind, we talk about paying off your unfunded liability, your amortization period still is 25 years on it. So when we're talking about your payroll growth assumption, we're really talking about a 25-year period. So can those salary increases be sustained over 25 years? Probably not. So really kind of looking at a long-term assumption, we believe that 2% still remains reasonable. And that's all I had as far as the economic assumptions. If there's any questions or discussion there.
I've got a question for you, Janie.
Of course.
Let me put my hand down first. All right, thank you. Do you think this, we've had a lot of inflationary costs that have been associated lately, and I know the local governments have, in order to retain personnel, have, as you noted, it's made rather significant increases in payroll. Was this due to lack of activity during the 20, 21, 22, those COVID years where not a lot was moving, and then you had a lot of positions going unfilled because people were unable to work or not working?
Sure. I mean, we've seen, I will say these large salary increases that you've seen in CRS, we've seen these across the country. Pretty much every plan I've worked on these last 2 years, we've seen huge increases in salary, and we've seen those salary losses for their active membership population. In general, we see 2 main drivers from that. The first driver, of course, is the inflation that you've seen, the inflation that you noted. Employers are trying to keep up with inflation, trying to keep up with cost of living. So they're trying to give their employees those salary increases. The second is, we had that big turnover after the pandemic. So employers were trying to keep the employees that they wanted, and they were doing that with those salary increases as well. So we were kind of hit double with that.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Mr. Cheatham has his hand raised.
Of course.
Jenny, I'd be curious, and I know you don't have time to go into it right now, but I'd be real curious to know what goes into your all's assumptions with regard to payroll growth. It's one of the things that I noticed in your charts and what I've seen and what I experienced in my time. One of the things that kept local governments from hiring people is because they had no idea what was going to be happening to their contribution rates. If you don't know whether you're going to be making a contribution rate at 20% or at a 30% level, you're not apt to go out and do a lot of hiring. And in our case, we were cutting back in order to pay for those contribution rates. So to what extent, I guess my question is, to what extent in your assumptions on this are you all factoring in the fact that this contribution rate now is flattened out to where it's a pretty predictable, or should be a pretty predictable expense? To me, that and the higher, if you've got higher inflation, you're going to have higher wages. It's just common sense. So to what extent do those two things play a role in this assumption?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you want to think forward looking. lower contribution rates, members you would think employers could hire more people. We could potentially start seeing increases in your active membership, which is that second piece there, could also drive the increase in membership payroll. We haven't seen that. If we actually go up a little bit on this chart, you can see we saw a big dip in 2021 as far as your active membership payroll. So we're still kind of climbing back up as far as active membership headcount back up as of 2023. You can kind of see that blue line there dipped a little bit. So we haven't seen that yet. Obviously, we would love to see the active membership headcount go up even more. That would be great for the fund to get more membership payroll in. If we do start to see that trend, we will keep an eye on this assumption. But right now, we're just not seeing that trend quite yet to justify a change.
I'm not so much. I don't know that you're going to see a trend in numbers. I think you first see the trend just in what you're seeing now in actual payroll. You got to pay and keep what you got, what you want to keep before you can go out and hire new. And in this labor market, there's pretty difficult to find anybody to hire new anyway.
Right.
So I noticed your numbers here on the chart are based over the last 10 years. Do you all have what those averages have been for the last 3 and 5 years? Somewhere where you can share that? Not now, obviously, but okay. I'd be interested in seeing that.
Yes. I mean, we certainly do have them over the last shorter term, but again, we do like to make sure that this is sustainable over the 25-year amortization period.
Dr. Hackbart has his hand raised.
Well, another consideration I think that we need to think about, and that is that we've had a period where there's been a significant infusion of federal funds to state and local governments as part of the recovery from the pandemic. And also revenues have been enhanced, particularly in those cases where sales tax was a revenue base or income taxes. And of course, in Kentucky, we don't have sales tax for local government, but certainly I think you had a period where, in effect, state and local governments had the opportunity to raise salaries in reaction to inflation. And of course, inflation in turn basically increased sales tax revenues and also had an impact on income taxes as well. So this is probably a temporary period. So it is sort of a blip, I suppose, and we need to watch that as we go forward to whether or not this maybe temporary enhancement of state and local government revenues is continuing, or if it's just a pause in the long-term growth path. But certainly there are two sides of the question, both in terms of increased salaries, but also there's been an opportunity to increase salaries because of increased revenue, partially the result of inflation. So.
I agree with you. I think on the local government side, given where local government revenue comes from, of course, they're capped on property tax revenue, but the inflationary pressures flow through the other two big revenue drivers, and that's occupational tax and insurance premium tax.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So both of those, I can tell you from writing checks, both of those have gone up quite a bit here over the last few years.
Any further questions or comments about the actuarial assumptions we just heard about?
No, I'd make a motion we accept Janie's recommendations as presented.
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any more discussion on the motion? If you see none, we'll proceed to vote on the accepting of that report. All in favor say aye, please.
Right.
Anyone opposed? And the motion passes, and thank you for that hard work. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the historic review of the CERS unfunded pension liability. And Janie, are you addressing that?
I am. You're not rid of me yet. So we got a really good question from the board to kind of look at how the unfunded liability has grown over the last decade and really the sources of the growth in that unfunded liability. And it was a really good question. So we put together this chart for the board to look at that growth in the unfunded liability. So kind of some background on this chart here. If you look at the year 2005 through 2016, we based our data based on a PFM report that was produced in 2016. They did an in-depth look into the funds and kind of looked at the sources of the change in the unfunded liability for those years. 2017 going forward to 2023, we used our own valuations. That's when we became the actuary. We used our own valuations and our own data there. So we'll kind of take through each of these going forward. So if you kind of look starting in 2005, you can see the unfunded liability was 326 million. Moving forward, looking at 2016, you can see the unfunded liability had grown to just over $4.5 billion. And then if we look at the last valuation, we are at $6.7 billion. So we're going to look at kind of the sources behind that change and how we got there. Sorry, we'll stay on that side. We're going to stay on this slide the whole time. So the red, we're going to kind of start from the bottom up here. So that red there, it's labeled as the funding contributions. And really what this means is it's the unfunded liability is growing due to the fact that the contributions are not sufficient to pay off the unfunded liability. So again, you guys probably have heard this analogy before, but if you think about your unfunded liability as a mortgage, you think of that as any kind of loan. When you're making payments, you're first paying off the interest that mortgage is accruing, and then you're paying off the principal. But what's happening here is what we refer to as negative amortization. And essentially the payments that were being made to the fund were not sufficient to even pay off the interest that the unfunded liability was accruing. So it was growing. There's two main reasons why those contributions might not be sufficient. The first is employers are not making the full actuarially determined contribution. That's not really the driver here for the CERS funds. And that's not really what was happening. The second is that the actually determined contributions weren't sufficient to pay off that unfunded liability. There's two things, two main drivers behind that is one is if you have a high payroll growth assumption and a high amortization rate at the beginning of, in a high amortization period, what's happening is you're never really paying off that interest. So if you think back to the period of 2005 to 2016, we had a payroll growth assumption of around 4%. So higher than our current 2% assumption. And we also had periodic resettings of our amortization period. So when you have a high payroll growth assumption, essentially what you're saying is you're going to make smaller contributions today and higher contributions in the future. You're essentially backloading your contributions. But if you're constantly resetting that amortization period, you never get to the end of it. So you're always making those smaller contributions. So that's what was happening here. Essentially, your unfunded liability was continuing to grow with interest, and we weren't making those contributions. But you can see it continued to grow, but in 2022, we've kind of turned the corner here. What we have is we've made progress in our amortization period. Again, we're at about 25 years now, and we've lowered that payroll growth assumption to 2%. We fully phased in those actually determined rates. And so what we're at now is we're at a period of positive amortization, where when we make contributions to the fund, we're expecting that unfunded liability to continue go down each year. And again, that's what you want to see. It'll be small at first, but the further you go into your amortization period, each year we go through, we're going to see that unfunded liability drop off more and more. So that's what we want to see with the fund. But that's if we're just working in a vacuum. Obviously, there's gains and losses and changes, and that's what the rest of this chart is going to show you here. I'm going to jump to the biggest color on this screen, and that is the orange here. That's your assumption changes. Obviously, we have a big jump in 2017. That is the change in the investment return assumption down to the 6.25%. Essentially, what you're saying is we're expecting lower investment returns in the future, so we're going to have to make up with that with higher monetary contributions. That increases your unfunded liability. Another big jump in 2019 here. That's when we went to the full projection of mortality improvement for your members, essentially to stop us from having to constantly change that mortality assumption every few years. So that was a big improvement for the fund's sustainability as well. And then you can see in 2023, we actually had a decrease here, and that was the change in the investment return assumption back up to 6.5%. The other smaller colors that you're going to see here is the blue. These are your liability gains and losses. Essentially, your liability future benefit payments are going to be higher or lower than we currently assumed. So your liability is going to be higher or lower. So you can see it stayed relatively stable. We've had some bigger losses these last few years. And again, those are those salary increases that we were just talking about, higher projected salaries, higher projected benefit payments, higher liabilities increases your unfunded liability. So then if we look at the yellow here, those are your benefit changes. So early in 2005 to 2016, a lot of these were COLAs that weren't funded. Those are the benefit changes that we saw there. But what you can see is going forward is you can see those benefit changes have stayed relatively labeled. That yellow is pretty much the same size. And what that really means is the funds haven't had any material benefit changes in the past 5 to 6 years that weren't funded. And then finally, we have the investment gains or losses. These are your assets earning more or less than you were assuming. And another good thing here is you can see those green bars have stayed relatively stable, over the last 5 to 6 years. And what that means is, with your investment markets, that there's going to be investment volatility in individual years. That's just the inherent volatility of your investment markets. But what you want to see is those gains or losses offsetting each other over the long term. So when we see that green bar, those investment gains and losses staying relatively stable, that's what we want to see. One, that means our investment return assumption isn't too aggressive. It also means that our investment smoothing that we use for our actual valuation is working. It's keeping the volatility out of our valuation results. And so if you go to the next slide there, this is the C hazardous fund. Again, almost the exact same story, just a different scale. But that's all I have for on this, but I'm happy to open it up to questions, discussions by the board.
Thank you. That's very illuminating. That's a good presentation. Appreciate that. Very helpful. Something we've been thinking about, so we appreciate you producing that. It does help.
Of course.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Janie. Ed, we're going to move into the strategic plan discussion. Do you want to lead us on that, please?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Each of the committees of the CERS board had been asked to put together a strategic plan for that committee. We started that process before KPPA started their strategic planning process. Now, just this morning, I've had an opportunity to speak with Ryan about a lot of things, but about strategic planning specifically. And I agree that we should, as a committee, look to embed our strategic planning objectives into the 4 buckets that have been established through the KPPA strategic planning process. And that's what you see in front of you are 4 initiatives for this committee that are placed inside the 4 buckets that have been established by the strategic planning initiative of KPPA. Now, that process has slowed a little bit from KPPA's standpoint to wait on Ryan as it should have, but I'm excited to see us move forward with that process and with our committee's work embedded in it. So I'll just very briefly discuss the 4 items that are here for our process. And as you'll see, the Actuary Committee, our involvement from a strategic planning process is going to be mostly focused on governance. What the committee has just heard from our actuary are the economic assumptions that go into our valuation. But there are also demographic assumptions that go into that valuation as well. And I'll speak to just the rise in the assumed rate that the board took last fiscal year, which resulted in about approximately $100 million less contribution from the employers. But only 50% of that was related to the economic factors that Janie just went over. The other 50% were related to demographic factors such as life expectancy, retirement age, and employee turnover. So said another way, whether the assumed rate had been changed at all, there still would have been a $50 million reduction in what employers paid into the system. So I don't want to focus on the implementation dates, because as we work with KPPA to do that, we'll have some different dates. I will say that the second one, to be 100% funded, that we won't be 100% funded until 2049, not 2048. But we'll also continue to work with the General Assembly to see that we don't end up with negative amortization, and Janie just went over what that was very eloquently, so that we don't end up with actuarial backloading in our system. And finally, from an organizational standpoint, we're going to ask the actuary to actually perform some stress testing for us on an incremental basis. That's a key risk management tool, and you take extreme scenarios that have some validity, but are possibly feasible, and you stress your portfolio to see what it would look like if those things were in fact to happen. If we had a 2% decline in GDP, if we had a 25% decrease in equity prices, so that we'll better be able to gauge where our portfolio stands and what the resilience of it is. So I'm comfortable with the four bullets that we have here, comfortable that they're situated in the appropriate bucket to align ourselves with KPPA, and would ask that the committee seek to adopt these for the strategic plan for this committee. I see that Dr. Hackbart has his hand up.
Oh, no, I just didn't take my hand down. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll make that motion then.
We have a motion to adopt the strategic plan as presented. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Ms. Carver. We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All in favor of adopting that motion, please say aye.
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 And opposed, like sign. Seeing none, the motion is adopted unanimously. Thank you very much. Ed, I've run out of things to talk about. Is there anything else we need to discuss before we adjourn?
No, sir.
Thank you. All right, then, if it meets with your pleasure, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We'll have a motion.
Second?
We'll see a second, and all in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
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 We stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone, very much for your participation.
Aye.